are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining me today. This is a training that is near and dear to my heart as we continue our crash course series. Today's topic is going to be ADHD. And the reason why this is near and dear to my heart is for those of you who do not know, I have 5 children and they are all diagnosed with ADHD. And so over the years, I have learned a lot for sure, not just about ADHD, but about my children and about myself and my ability to care for my children and be able to pour into them the proper way that they need. So let me admit some more of these people. I know we'll have some people coming in as I talk. So while we're waiting for everyone to log in, if you wouldn't mind, please put your email address in the chat box so that I can send you your post survey and get your feedback on the topics discussed today, and also any information that you guys might want to share with me. Please, please, please do not hesitate to either send me an email or give me a phone call, both of which are listed on my screen here, my email address and my phone number. So I do appreciate your feedback. For those of you who share it with me, it does make my job easier to know which direction I need to go into when it comes to creating these presentations for you. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. I will say that the first part of this is a little heavy scientifically. I go through a lot of the brain and parts of the brain and functioning of the brain. And the reason why I do that is not to bore you to death, but I think that the better we understand ADHD, the easier it's going to be for us to not only identify behaviors, but address those behaviors with our children. And since ADHD is found to be hereditary, there may be some of yourself that you see in these. And just knowing what the disorder is like and what the symptoms are, what the behaviors are like, can actually help with our self-esteem, right? Sometimes we go through a life undiagnosed and we struggle and we think, well, there's something defective with me or there's a default that I have, when in reality it's just ADHD, right? And so if you do see some of yourself in these symptoms, congratulations, you're probably like every other parent who has a child with ADHD and discovered, hey, I probably have it too, right? So again, education is the way that we cultivate compassion. And especially for caregiving for children who have ADHD, compassion is key with just building up their self-esteem and finding good ways to help them become more self-sufficient. And so with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, oh wait, wrong slide. Second of all, first of all, I want to make it clear that I am not a licensed therapist yet. Working on it. And I'm a researcher, right? So of course I do have lived experience, but I do want to give you all information that's backed by science, backed by research. And so that's the information that I've presented for you today as a researcher. And they are, of course, for educational purposes only. I'm not trying to treat or diagnose any illness. And I don't want this to be a substitute for treatments and therapies by licensed professionals, okay? So of course, this is going to be great information to get us to understand what's going on with ADHD, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination a manual for tackling all that ADHD needs to be tackled, okay? So our agenda today is we are going to define ADHD, okay? Then we're going to talk about the ADHD brain and the ADHD nervous system. Then we're going to discuss 3 types of ADHD. We're going to go over fibs and rumination, which are often common with people who have ADHD, or particularly children. And then I'm going to follow up with a few caregiver tips, okay? So what is ADHD? Now, this is just straight from the CDC website. ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders of childhood. And so for those of you who don't know what neurodevelopmental means, that means the way that the brain develops. Okay, that's all that means. So it's usually first diagnosed in childhood and it often lasts into adulthood. Children with ADHD may have trouble paying attention, controlling impulsive behaviors. They may act without thinking about what the results will be. That's what impulsivity is, and be overly active. So the causes of ADHD are still unknown. Scientists are studying causes and risk factors, in an effort to find better ways to manage and reduce the chances of a person having ADHD. But current research shows that genetics play an important role, which is why we find it in families. And recent studies link genetic factors with ADHD. Research, however, does not support the popularly held views that ADHD is caused by eating too much sugar, watching too much television, your parenting style, or social and environmental factors such as poverty or family chaos. Now, these may be contributing factors to worse symptoms, right? Especially in certain people, but the evidence is not strong enough to conclude that they're the main causes of ADHD, okay? So I know there is even still some discourse about the validity of even ADHD being a thing. I know when I first heard the term ADHD, I thought, well, that's just the way they're parenting, or blah, 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 all the judgmental things that you say when you're not well educated. But then boom, all five of my kids had it. And so I had to actually dig into what it was. So it's a very common held belief that it is, about too much sugar, too much video games, but the science just does not back that up. So that's a false conclusion that has been drawn in our culture. So here's where I'm going to kind of get into the brain stuff. And I apologize in advance because I do know ADHD runs in families. There's a good chance that if you have a child with ADHD that you yourself have it. And so this portion of the presentation might be a little hard for you. I know it was a little difficult for me to try to put it together, but bear with me. It's some really good information. And again, I'm trying to cultivate compassion through education. Okay, so the ADHD brain and neurotransmitters. So before I tell you about the special brain chemicals of neurotransmitters, I'm going to explain to you a little bit about brain anatomy. So there are millions of cells or neurons densely packed into various regions of the brain. Each region is responsible for a particular function. Some regions interact with our outside world, so interpreting vision, hearing, and other sensory inputs. And they help us figure out what to do and say. And other regions interact with our internal world, our body, and in order to regulate functions of our organs. So for the various regions of our brain to do their job, they must be linked to one another with extensive wiring. Of course, there's not really wires in the brain, but that's just a term we use to kind of describe the pathways or the neural circuits that carry information from one brain region to another. Okay, so that's what neurotransmitters, they transmit information. So that's what helps your brain talk to itself to kind of function, keep you functioning. Okay. So information is transmitted along the pathways via the action of neurotransmitters. And interestingly enough, that scientists have identified 50 different ones, and there could be as many as 200. So there's a lot going on up there. And each neuron produces tiny quantities of a specific neurotransmitter, which released into the microscopic space that exists between the neurons called synapses, right? You kind of probably remember this from your sixth grade to ninth grade biology, right? Let me see, I lost my track of my notes here. Here we go. So that stimulates the next cell in the pathway into others. So that's kind of like the chain that happens. So how does a specific neurotransmitter know precisely which neuron to attach to when there's so many other neurons nearby? So each neurotransmitter has a unique structure or a key kind of that's able to attach only to a specific neuron with a corresponding site or a receptor site or lock. Okay, so when the key finds the neuron bearing the right lock, the neurotransmitter binds and stimulates that neuron. Okay, so all that says is that there's specific keys for specific locks in your brain, and when they connect, that's when the action happens. Okay. So brain scientists have found that deficiencies in specific neurotransmitters underlie many common disorders like anxiety, mood disorders, anger control problems, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so it's a big deal when these don't work well. And ADHD was the first disorder found to be the result of a deficiency of a specific neurotransmitter. And in this case, it's norepinephrine. I know how to say it, but when I go to say it, it doesn't come out of my mouth right. Norepinephrine. And that is the first disorder found to respond to medications to correct the underlying deficiency. So like all neurotransmitters, norepinephrine is created in the brain. It's synthesized in the brain. And the basic building block of each norepinephrine molecule is DOPA. And this is the tiny molecule that's converted into dopamine, which in turn is converted into norepinephrine. Okay, so basically that just means with no norepinephrine, there's no dopamine. And dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters, one of those special chemicals that helps us regulate our mood and our attention. Okay, so, and here we go again. I'm really sorry about boring you here. But the ADHD seems to involve an impaired neurotransmitter activity in 4 functional regions of the brain. So the frontal cortex, one, that is the region that orchestrates high-level functioning. So like maintaining your attention, organization, and executive function. That's, I can get to A to B by doing these steps, right? That's what your executive functioning is. So a deficiency in norepinephrine within the brain region might cause inattention, problems with organization, and or impaired social or executive functioning. The limbic system is the region located deeper in the brain, and that's what regulates our emotions. So deficiency in this region might result in restlessness, inattention, and emotional volatility, okay? The basal ganglia, the neural circuits that regulate communication within the brain, and information from all regions of the brain enter the basal ganglia and is then relayed to the correct sites in the brain. So a deficiency in this space can cause information to kind of short circuit, resulting in inattention or impulsivity. And then finally, we've got the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And this is a major relay system among many pathways that enter and leave the brain. So it's like a railway in the brain. A deficiency in the RAS can cause inattention, impulsivity, or hyperactivity. So these 4 regions interact with one another, and so a deficiency in one region may cause a problem in one or more of the other regions. And so ADHD may be the result of problems in one or more of these regions. And so we don't yet know which region of the brain is the source of specific ADHD symptoms, and we can't tell whether a problem lies with the deficiency of norepinephrine itself or one of the chemicals that it produces, like DOPA and dopamine. So doctors really have to rely on clinical experience to determine which medication to try for each child and which dosage. So that could be why if you have your child on medication or if you yourself are taking ADHD medication, your results may vary because of these different transmitters and different types or different areas of the brain can produce different symptoms. So someday when our knowledge of the brain is greater, the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD will be more nuanced. So instead of diagnosing simply ADHD and prescribing a stimulant, you might be able to say, well, Billy's ADHD is caused by a deficiency in DOPA in the frontal cortex and they need medication A, okay? That kind of thing. So ADHD medications, in simple terms, basically just raise the level of norepinephrine within the brain. And then that helps the person to function more normally or more typically. And once the drug wears off, then your symptoms return, okay? So I do have, hold on, let me make sure. Okay, I do have a little video that helps to explain this a little better. So it's only about 2 minutes, so we're gonna watch this together. All right.
Should it have sound?
Oh, can you not hear it?
No.
Yikes. Okay, well then that's pointless. Thanks for letting me know. So basically what it's saying is that if there is less transmitters, right, in the front brain, the cortex, then it's going to short circuit the signals in the back of the brain. Okay, that's really all it says. So we can move on. Thanks for letting me know, George. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how the ADHD brain is structurally different. So neuroimaging studies, which basically means we can take pictures of the brain, it has revealed the structural differences in the ADHD brain. So several studies have pointed to a smaller prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and decreased volume of the posterior inferior vermis of the cerebellum. Say that 5 times fast. So basically, those are all the parts of the brain that play important roles in function and attention. So the study is saying that that part of the brain in people who have ADHD is slightly smaller, okay, or underdeveloped. So that means that ADHD is not a difference in behavioral preference. It is a difference in how the brain is structured, okay? So what may look like behavioral choices like laziness, sloppiness, and forgetfulness are likely due to differences in brain structure. And the reason why I'm going through all of this is because I think it's very, very important for those of us who are caregivers of children who have ADHD that we need to stop labeling them as lazy or sloppy, okay? Because this is something they cannot control. Just like if someone had dyslexia or if someone had epilepsy or any other diagnoses, right? They can't control that. And so the behaviors, while frustrating to the caregiver, are really not about behavior discipline type things, okay? This is something they can't control, okay? So this is when we're going to start talking about the default mode network. And I thought this was fascinating. And this is something that researchers have discovered recently, fairly recently, because of the way that we can now see the brain in action through these imaging. Okay, so I'm going to explain it to you in the science way, and then I'm going to give you like a real talk way. Okay, so if you zone out on this part, it's fine. I'm going to reiterate in the next slide. So the default mode network is the DMN. Represents the regions of the brain that are active when no specific tasks are being performed. So it's more active when individuals are at a wakeful rest, engaging in internal tasks like daydreaming, recalling memories, or assessing other people's perspectives, right? So if you're just kind of thinking, right, just in your brain. So when you work on something active, though, willful goal-directed tasks, this brain network deactivates and the attentional pathways engage. So you can see here, I got a little picture. This right here is the DMN, and these are your attention pathways, okay? They light up when you're working. So in ADHD, the daydreaming brain does not quiet down when the attention circuits turn on. So people with ADHD can instruct their focus control system to pay attention to the task at hand, like a homework assignment, but the circuits that connect the DMN fail to send the instructions to quiet down. So when the DMN notices a text or a game alert or something like that on the screen, if they're trying to do schoolwork, the emotional center or emotional interest centers will light up and overwhelm that weaker voice of the cognitive centers, okay? And so we used to consider this part of the brain what they call the resting state. But once we were able to scan, we saw how active the brain was in this restful state. And we realized it's not really resting at all, right? So that's why they changed it to the default mode network, okay? So let's see here. The next slide gives us a little bit better of a description. So what is the default mode network? So the default mode network, again, is the region of the brain that is activated when your brain isn't focused on a goal-directed activity. So when you're sitting at your desk, you're staring out the window, you're in the shower, you're driving along an endless highway, your mind starts to wander during a lecture, okay, that's when your brain is entering this DMN, the default mode network. So it's the brain regions at play when you're daydreaming, recalling memories, or thinking about the future. So think of the default mode network as our reset, a brain at recess, right? So it's wandering wherever it feels like. 1 minute it's on the slide, the next it's heading over to the swings, and a few minutes after that it's doing the monkey bars over and over again. So our brains do the same thing, thinking about one thing and then the next. But because the default mode network incorporates the memory and feeling centers of the brain, a lot of the playing, quote unquote, that your brain is doing can be very emotional and often focused on the past, okay? So recess isn't the only place that your brain hangs out during the day. It also gets to work with a network called the task positive network. Okay, so when our brain is engaged in task oriented things, this is the part of the brain that kicks in. So the task positive network, or the TPN, is part of the brain that's responsible for goal directed activity, like homework or work, your regular work as an adult, right? So this is the network of the brain regions that light up when we focus on a task that requires conscious attention. So the task positive network involves more of our frontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for rational and sequential thought, and less of the emotional, personal memory stores, okay? So the TPN is where our brain goes when it's called in from recess. It's the brain hard at work studying, learning, creating, and problem solving. So all brains have a task positive network, or TPN, and all brains have a default mode network. But the ADHD brain have a particularly hard time leaving recess. Not just because recess is compelling, but because an ADHD brain's default mode network doesn't turn off when the task positive network turns on, like a neurotypical brain does. So basically, you're trying to not daydream and you're trying to not, let your mind wander when that part of your brain is still active, right? So you're trying to go against the activity that your brain is doing. If any of you guys have ever tried to outsmart your brain, you can realize how frustrating that is, right? It's very difficult to shift your brain to do one thing when you want to do one thing when it's doing another. Specifically, if you have a deficiency in these neurotransmitters, so that your brain is not communicating with itself properly. So if you think about a classroom and the playground having no wall in between them, just desks set up right next to some of the most colorful and intriguing and interesting playground equipment you can imagine. So even if an ADHD brain comes in and sits down at their desk, the siren call of the monkey bars starts calling pretty quickly, and pretty soon it just gets up and wanders over and starts playing. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means you're not going to get a lot of work done. But it also has some other difficult impacts as well. So we're going to talk about a few of those. ADHD distraction. So having the monkey bars set up right next to your desk can make it pretty hard to stay focused and on track, right? Especially if you're a child who already has impulse control just because of your age. So because the playground, or the area of your brain that where it gets to follow every impulse and every interest, never goes away. It's like your brain is playing two channels at the same time. It's flipping between C-SPAN and Bravo, right? So, one might be more important for your life, right? Get you some good information. But, Bravo's got the Real Housewives, right? And they're pretty compelling. So you're constantly flipping back and forth, hearing that siren call of the default mode network again, the minute you finally sit down and settle to get back into work. So that's over and over and over again. So if you can imagine, your child is always trying to fight this compelling distraction of their daydreaming mind. It's very difficult for them to focus. Next, obsessive thinking. So because the brain gets to wander anywhere it wants to on the playground, it's able to stay stuck in one spot. So swinging on the swing for hours and hours, right? Or going up and down the slide over and over again. So because this default mode network playground is so compelling, it pretty much always just does that, right? It gets stuck in one line of thought over and over again. So this is where obsessive and ruminating thoughts come from in an ADHD brain, and we'll talk about rumination later. It's that endless loop of one activity over and over again. And because there's no purpose or goal telling your brain we're done, we can stop, it stays there, okay? So, you think about that little comment maybe somebody said to you at a barbecue, it kind of got you miffed, that's going to be on repeat all the time, okay? So rumination, or that obsessive thinking, is like that rumination, okay? Your brain just gets to keep playing that loop over and over again. And then next, anxiety and depression. This happens a lot. Often ADHD and anxiety are diagnosed at the same time. So as anyone who's survived elementary school can attest, as much as we want our playgrounds to be places of fun and laughter and friendships, sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes playgrounds can be torturous. So the default mode network playground is no different, because it's a place of purposeless emotion, memory, and forecasting. It's ripe for depression and anxiety. Okay, so that's being a spot where our brain will circle over and over the most emotionally compelling thoughts, like negative thoughts or fear-inducing thoughts. Okay, so this is also something you have to be very aware of if you're taking care of children who have ADHD. They are prone to anxiety and depression because their brain will constantly loop around negative thoughts over and over and over again in their brain. Okay, and if any of you guys have ever had that happen, which I think most of us have, it's incredibly painful, even as adults. So just imagine what it's like for children. So now we're going to talk about the ADHD nervous system. And I use squirrels because that's kind of like the quintessential ADHD spirit animal, right? And so I have 5 squirrels running around my house. And so I thought it was adorable. So that's when I use it. So the ADHD nervous system is a unique and special creation that regulates attention and emotions in different ways than the nervous system in those without the condition. So ADHD is not a damaged or defective nervous system. It's a nervous system that works well using its own set of rules. So many people with ADHD and their families want to drop the term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder because it describes the opposite of what they experience every moment of their lives. So it's hard to call something a disorder when it actually has a lot of positives to it, right? So ADHD is not a damaged or defective nervous system. It's a nervous system that works well using its own set of rules. So those with the condition do not have a shortage of attention. They pay too much attention to everything. So that is the hallmark of ADHD nervous system, is not attention deficit, but inconsistent attention, okay? So despite ADHD's association with learning disabilities, most people with it have significantly higher than average IQs. And they also use that higher IQ in a different way than a neurotypical person would. And a neurotypical person is just somebody who does not have ADHD or a neurodevelopmental disorder or diagnosis. So by the time most people with the condition reach high school, they're able to tackle problems that stump everybody else. And they can jump to solutions that no one else saw. So those with the condition, again, don't have a shortage of attention. They just pay too much attention to everything. And I think that if you raise your child, or if you have ADHD and you're raised in a supportive space, you're more likely to see it as a strength. But as we'll get into it now, some of the more emotional things I'll talk about later, that's not always the case for everybody. And so they see it as a deficiency or a disorder. So everyone with ADHD knows that they can get in the zone, right? And that's kind of like where we see an ADHD child where they can't focus on one thing, but they focus on another, right? That's kind of getting in that zone, getting into that hyperfixation, what have you, right? So when they're in the zone, they have no impairments or executive function deficits that they may have had before entering that zone. So people with ADHD know that they're bright and clever, but they are never sure whether the abilities will show up when they need them. So the fact that the symptoms and the impairments come and go throughout the day is a defining trait of ADHD. And that's what makes it so frustrating, right? Because you know you can do it, but your brain just doesn't want to cooperate. And that's incredibly frustrating. So ADHD individuals get in the zone when they are challenged or thrown into a competitive environment. Sometimes a new or novel task will attract their attention, but as we all know, novelty is short-lived, and everything will get old after a while. And most people with ADHD nervous systems can engage in tasks and access their abilities when the task is urgent, like a do or die deadline, for instance. And that's why procrastination is almost a universal impairment with people who have ADHD. They want to get their work done, but they can't get started until a task becomes interesting, challenging, or urgent. And I can attest to this in my own life, even specifically with this presentation, because I finished it this morning. And I've been working on it for a long time, but it's just that, I needed that do or die deadline. I needed that novelty. I needed that, that urgency to get my brain to kick into gear. Okay. So how the rest of the world functions is a little different. So 90% of non-ADHD people in the world are referred to as neurotypical, and that doesn't mean that they're better or quote unquote normal, okay? It just means that their neurology is accepted and endorsed by the world, right? The world is set up for them. And people with neurotypical nervous system being interested in the task or challenged or finding a novelty in that task is helpful, but it's not a requirement, right? You can still do it without being interested, right? You can still be productive and bored, okay? But an ADHD brain doesn't work that way, okay? So neurotypical people will typically, I keep saying typical, will use 3 different factors to decide what to do, how to get started on it, and how to stick with it until it's completed. So 1, the concept of importance, right? They think they should get it done. 2, the concept of secondary importance. That means that they're motivated by the fact that their parents or their teachers or their boss or somebody that they respect thinks the task is important, and they go ahead and complete it. And the concept of rewards for doing a task and consequences or punishments for not doing it. So that's how a neurotypical person would decide if it's important to do something, right? And see it through. But a person with an ADHD nervous system has never been able to use the idea of importance or rewards to start a task. They know it's important, they like rewards, and they don't like punishment. But for them, the things that motivate the rest of the world are just nagging to them, right? So that'd be very difficult for your child, especially. So the inability to use importance and rewards to get motivated has a lifelong impact on people with ADHD. So how can those with ADHD choose between multiple options if they can't use the concepts of importance and rewards to motivate them? How can they make major decisions if the concepts of importance and rewards are neither helpful in making a decision or motivation to do what they choose? This understanding explains why none of the cognitive and behavioral therapies used to manage ADHD symptoms have lasting benefits. So it might work for a little bit, but it's not going to fix it, quote unquote, right? So researchers view ADHD as stemming from a deficit or a defective-based nervous system, but ADHD is stemming from a nervous system that works perfectly well. ADHD is stemming from a nervous system that works perfectly well by its own set of rules. So unfortunately, it doesn't work by any of the rules or techniques taught in a neurotypical world. So that's why people with ADHD have difficulty in the standard school systems, which is built on repeating what someone else thinks is important and relevant. People with ADHD struggle to flourish in the standard job that pays people to work on what someone else says is important, right? People with ADHD are disorganized because about every organizational system out there is built on two things: prioritization and time management. And people with ADHD do not do well with prioritization and time management. And people with ADHD have a hard time choosing between alternatives because everything has the same lack of importance, right? Do I want boring or boring? Which one's more important, right? So all the alternatives look the same. And people with an ADHD nervous system know that if they get engaged with a task, that they can do it, okay? And so that's incredibly frustrating to know you've got what it takes, but not be able to engage that capacity. That's why it's so frustrating, okay? Let's see here. Next, we're going to talk about the types of ADHD. So I'm just going to run through some of these symptoms, and you may see yourself in some of these. For me, it's very eye-opening to say, oh, these are ADHD symptoms, not behaviors that my child is choosing to do that need disciplinary action for. So just, kind of just go through it and say, oh, that's me, that's my kid, right? So hyperactive and impulsive type ADHD. So this is the one that most people think of when you hear ADHD. Okay, so the need for constant movement, to fidget and squirm and struggle to stay seated. Children often appear to act as if they're driven by a motor and they run around excessively. People of all ages with ADHD, they may talk nonstop, interrupt others, blurt out answers, and struggle with self-control. And this type of ADHD is more recognizable and diagnosed in children and men. Okay, so some of the symptoms: often fidgets or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat, often leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected, often runs about or climbs in situations where it's inappropriate, often unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly, often on the go, acting as if driven by a motor, excessively talking, blurting out answers before questions have been completed. I'm guilty of doing that. Often has difficulty waiting their turn and will often interrupt or intrude on others. So if you have, or you or your child has 6 of those 9 descriptions, that they'll probably diagnose for ADHD, hyperactive and impulsive ADHD. So, if we think about the young boy bouncing off the walls, interrupting teachers mid-sentence, that's a pretty easy way to spot ADHD, right? That's an easy one to spot. So fidgety, a child with hyperactive ADHD often fidgets or taps their hands and feet, squirms in their seat. They might fall out of their chair more often than peers. My son's always falling out of his chair. I'm like, what are you doing? He just pops out all the time. They might need to pick up everything and play with it, right? An adult might be shifting in their chair, fidgeting with papers during work meetings. And if you tell them to sit still, they're going to find it mentally painful or physically uncomfortable to do it. Okay, so the hyperactive brain is just ready to jump to the next thing. So if you have a child who's fidgety and you say, just sit still, and they do it for like maybe 12 seconds before they burst right back out, it's because they are experiencing a physical discomfort to just sit still. Okay, it's very difficult. So restlessness, again, that inability to sit still, walking away from the desk in the classroom in the middle of a lesson. An adult might leave their office or a meeting or an assigned post before they're supposed to, right? Running around, crashing into walls, climbing on things. They're often described as jumpers or acting like Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, right? Noisy children and adults with ADHD, hyperactive ADHD, are often singing or humming or even talking to themselves. And they may be loud talkers and often can't be active quietly. Okay. Never stop talking, right? Talk all day long. Impulsive reactions. So hyperactive children could be the ones blurting out answers in the classroom before being called on, retaliating immediately against the playground slight, or finishing other people's sentences. They also struggle to wait their turn, which is very difficult, and they can be seen as disruptive. Okay, so adults and children with ADHD are often going to interrupt or intrude on others. They talk over others, insert themselves in conversations or activities that they don't belong in. They might start playing with someone else's toy without seeking permission first. Those are just some examples. Next, we go to the inattentive type of ADHD. So inattentive type of ADHD will lead you to make careless mistakes because you'll have difficulty sustaining your attention, following detailed instructions, and organizing tasks and activities. So people who have inattentive type ADHD have a weak working memory. They're easily distracted by external stimuli, and they often lose things. And this is the type more commonly diagnosed in adults and girls, and it was formerly known as ADD, which kind of removed the hyperactivity. And the way I like to describe this one is it's a hyperactivity of the mind, right? Because if you remember that the neurodevelopmental part of it, that's your brain, right? So symptoms might not be as outward once you get older, or if you're socialized as a woman who were told to, keep quiet and be sweet, right? That doesn't mean that hyperactivity is not there at all. It's just all, in the brain. It's all in the mind. So here's some, the 9 descriptions here. If you or your child meets 6 of these, then they will be diagnosed with inattentive type ADHD. So often fails to give close attention to details or making careless mistakes in schoolwork or work or during other activities. Having a difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Often does not follow through on instructions or fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties at the workplace. Often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. They often avoid or dislikes or are reluctant to engage in tasks that require a sustained mental effort. My 16-year-old struggles with this a lot. When it comes to reading their English lit, they are very, very bored, and it's hard for them to grasp it. And so it's very difficult to get that done with them. Often losing things necessary for tasks or activities. Oh, I can't find my book bag. I can't find my pencil. I can't find my calculator, right? Often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, right? They can't just focus. They're being distracted by everything going on around them. And they are often forgetful in daily activities. So again, careless mistakes, short attention span, poor listening skills. So they might get like half the instructions that are relayed to them verbally, if that, and their notebooks are filled with doodles rather than notes, right? These people may need to record and listen to lectures more than once to get the full scope of the information being presented to them. They have a difficulty with follow through. So children and adults struggle with this. So that can look like they have a million small projects that have been started but never finished. A vegetable garden that got planted but never watered, right? The new organization system that was assembled but never used. Okay, that's the kind of thing that you're looking at for no follow through. Disorganization, right? Laziness or apathy. So you might say things like, well, he could pay attention if he tried to, or she's just not dedicated. That's why they missed so many deadlines, or that's why they got so many zeros at school, right? So inattentive symptoms can sometimes make someone look lazy or uncaring, especially if the ADHD is undiagnosed or hasn't been disclosed, right? So if you're an outsider looking in, you can think, well, this person's just disorganized or they're lazy because you don't know they have ADHD. So without treatment, they're actually prone to losing jobs and friends because of this inability to stay focused. Bermuda Triangle Syndrome. So this isn't just about misplacing keys or cell phones, right? People with inattentive ADHD will, find glasses in their freezers and frozen peas in their purse, right? They tend to misplace essential things that they need for living, like keys, wallets, backpacks, sports equipment on a daily basis. So if you found that you need a launch pad near the door to ensure you don't forget your cell phone or things like that, or you couldn't live without a locator device attached to your key ring, that could be a sign that you have inattentive ADHD, okay? Distractibility, so often considered daydreamers, doodling on your notes during a big meeting, or studying a fly on the wall, right? When your spouse is talking to you about bills, you're just staring at the fly. They could be nicknamed space cadets or written off as flaky. Many people misinterpret the inattentive individual's lack of focus as lack of interest, which isn't always the case. And they can get frustrated by their inability to pay attention, especially when it's important that they do so. And then finally, forgetfulness. So how many times have you missed a scheduled doctor or dentist appointment in the last year, inadvertently stood up friends for lunch, or joined a conference call 20 minutes late because you forgot all about it? These are common occurrences for adults who have inattentive ADHD, and children as well. So now we're going to talk about some of the more frustrating behaviors when it comes to caregiving for a child with ADHD. Is the fight, flight, freeze, or fib theory. So what if your child is lying, but that's not evidence of a character flaw or disrespect? What if their fibs are actually self-preservation strategy rooted in poor inhibition, emotional regulation, working memory, and attention, all hallmarks of ADHD? So this is the premise behind a new theory that's giving caregivers and educators a new neurological lens through which to view lies. So if you have a child with ADHD, you know that fibbing or lying can come up more frequently. And so the theory is that it is a way for them to be like a self-preservation mechanism designed to ensure their safety. So if you think about most people know about the fight or flight response, right? When you are faced with danger or stress, you can go into fight mode or you can go into flight mode, right? You're going to stand your ground or you're going to haul butt out of that, right? Well, now they're actually talking about a freeze that happens, right? So if you're in a situation where you're scared or your survival instincts kick in, you might just, freeze or play dead, right? You're petrified with fear, so you just freeze, okay? Well, now they're thinking that adding fib to it is also another fear response or stress response. So I won't bore you with any more of the brain science behind it because you all can either look it up or you've probably heard me talk about it before. But when we have that flood of that cortisol, that stress hormone, these are when these behaviors are engaged, okay? So fibbing can be used to protect a child from their perceived threat. So a fib mechanism can protect the child by obviously temporary protection from the feeling of having disappointed someone like a parent or a teacher. Fibbing also or often follows poor academic outcomes or incomplete assignments or projects or missed appointments or classes, right? Oh, I thought you told me you got this done, but you didn't. Why did you lie to me, right? Because they're afraid. They're trying to protect themselves. Deflection. So they deflect a parent or a significant other being angry with them and the anticipated consequence of that. Extensions, so they might be trying to buy some time, right? Oh yeah, well, I just got like one more paragraph I have to write and they haven't even started their paper, right? But they're just trying to buy some time. And then self-preservation, so preserving self-esteem and self-efficacy, perceived reduced self-esteem or failure due to an ADHD-related behavior that's ending in negative consequences. That also leads to shame and embarrassment. So a lie could prevent that shame and embarrassment, at least temporarily, right? So individual may lie to themselves even to avoid the fear of that perceived threat or danger of that current situation, okay? So lying, again, isn't about a character flaw in your child. It could just be a stress response that they're experiencing. Next, we have rumination. So ruminating is a very stressful space to be in. Remember I was talking kind of with those obsessive thoughts, where that daydreaming brain is always on the monkey bars, right? Rumination is your brain on the monkey bars, but you're not having fun. So they are intrusive, obsessive, and that's just part of living with ADHD. So no matter how hard you try to ignore them, those negative thoughts will just keep coming back, replaying in your head over and over and over again, even though you know it's not healthy. You just can't really think about anything else, right? So when you have ADHD, your mind is always on, which feels like thinking 10 thoughts at once. And that can be hard to express all those thoughts at once and difficult to prioritize which ones should be prioritized, right? So the tendency for impulsivity makes it difficult for those with ADHD, and they can often get burned by that impulsivity. And you can sometimes go to the opposite extreme and microanalyze, especially in social situations. My kids do this a lot. So of course, what you resist persists. So if you try to stop thinking these thoughts, they're just going to get louder. So it's kind of a rock and a hard place, right? And it's not really helpful to just say, well, just forget about that and relax. That's just not possible for an ADHD brain. Okay, and it's not helpful. So the neurodivergence of the ADHD brain will cause you to be prone to more rumination because of that default mode network, right? So it's kind of just running at that continuous loop. So we're going to talk about two different types of ruminating. There's negative rumination and anxious rumination. And one is usually about the past and the other one is about the future. So a negative rumination is usually about things that happen in the past that we don't like. So mistakes we've made or traumas we might have suffered. And ruminating thoughts can reach far back into our history, repeating our greatest failures, regrets, or pains. Okay. Or they can be less specific and just sound like shameful thoughts or generalized self-abuse, like I'm such a mess, I'm so lazy, no one likes me, right? That's the kind of stuff that your kids are stewing in a lot of the times, okay? So negative ruminations are a way to beat yourself up for not being perfect. Even though you may have met 95% of your goal or your intention, you'll find yourself ruminating over and over again about the 5% that didn't go right. Does that sound familiar? So negative ruminations will overemphasize the bad and make it seem like the bad outweighs the good, even when a vast majority of what's happened has gone well. Okay, so your kids are going to hyper focus on the really negative parts of what they perceive as the negative parts. Okay. Next, anxious rumination. So those are usually going to be about the future. So they're obsessive thoughts about things that we're scared of happening or things we want to keep from happening, things we want to avoid. So since anxious ruminations are mostly about the future, they're usually over topics and outcomes that may or may not even happen, right? So these are just imaginary scenarios, doomsday scenarios playing out in your brain. So that's why it's important to remember that our anxious ruminations are not about things that are inevitable or guaranteed to happen, even though they feel like they're bound to happen because the feelings of fear they generate are so real to us. Anxious ruminations are usually about control, where our objective is to gain control over a situation or to bolster our feelings of control over our lives in general. And I think we can kind of fall into these patterns whether we have a neurotypical brain or not. I think it's just part of our anxiety nervous system, right? But in ADHD, it's more pronounced. So to stop your brain from ruminating, here are some tips, okay? So first, we need to become aware that ruminating is happening and it's over irrational or unnecessary topics, right? And intentionally focus on something else and become engaged in that activity instead. So we're kind of distracting our brain from these ruminating, cycles, these loops, and we're submerging ourselves into something that's more positive, okay? So how do you do that when the ADHD brain struggles to get engaged? So here's some ideas for healthy distractions, and I'll go through these quickly. Exercise, right? If you're caught in your mind, the best thing to do is engage your body, okay? Because that distracts that. Journaling your thoughts. I've often said that when I don't put my thoughts on paper, they just bounce around in my head and they get louder and more crazy. It's like, think of a bouncy ball in an empty room. That's kind of what it's like. And so journaling them gives your negative thoughts or your ruminating thoughts a place to land, a place to be outside of your brain. Meditation, of course, that's very difficult for people with ADHD, but if you can even just do 5 to 10 minutes a day, it can be very helpful. Distracting yourself with fun, right? So find something stimulating and fun to do. So going out into nature is particularly effective, right? Or something that is giving you a sense of fun or novelty. Reframing your thinking. I do this with my kids all the time. When they say, I'm not good at X. Okay, well, let's try saying I'm working on developing the skill of X, right? Acknowledging the process gives you that feeling of like you're doing something, you're completing something, right? It's not as final as I'm not good at this, I'm just going to not do it, right? You're working towards. So reframing is just, not lying to yourself, but just thinking of it in a different way. Repeating a mantra or mantra, however you want to pronounce it. I do this a lot too. My mantra is I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, right? Because I get triggered and I get fearful. And so I have to remind myself that I'm safe, that I'm okay. Okay. So whatever that looks like for you or your child that you're taking care of, get that mantra and have them repeat that because that's a good way to distract your brain. Another one, play it out loud and then dispute it. Okay. I often tell my kids, what's the worst case scenario? And how would you manage that worst case scenario? What are your resources? What's available to you? Right. So you have a game plan that allows you to say, well, if worst case scenario happens, I already have a solution. So that way, the anxiety, that rumination, right, it's got somewhere to go. Right. So you have kind of shut it down by giving it an action plan. Next, medication. Okay, a lot of times people don't want to use medication, and I understand that. But if your child has ADHD and they're struggling, the medication will just kind of quiet that brain down, right? Quiet that activity, focus the brain where it needs to be focused, and it can really help with a lot of those more emotional symptoms of ADHD. Breaking it down into smaller tasks, right? Sometimes anxious rumination can be about a big or dreadful task that's looming ahead of you. So if you're stuck, try breaking it down. Say, what's the first step? What's the next step, right? And just do that one step. And then the next day, do another step if you can, if time permits, right? Smaller bites, make for easier digestion, right? And other positive distractions. So what other positive things they can do that will absorb your brain and get it focused on something else, right? Take your dog for a walk, listen to your favorite podcast, read a good book, play a game with your friends, right? Anything that will take away your brain from where it is and get it absorbed in something that's healthy and positive can get you out of that rumination loop. So if you have your kid kind of spinning their wheels in this way, distract them, find something else for them to do, okay? And I know I'm running low on time, so I'm gonna go through these next ones very quickly. Caregiver tips. So some of these might seem less conventional, especially when we think of, how we typically were raised or how we typically discipline our children. The ADHD brain is wired so differently that a lot of those tips and tricks for neurotypical children do not apply for people who have ADHD. So we can use reward over punishment. And I know that's might be abrasive to some of you, okay? But if you think about it, when you're an adult and you have a fully developed adult brain, you can gauge consequences, right? If I don't do A, then B will take place, okay? Children, however, do not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, and so they are very much in that black and white thinking, all or nothing, right? And it's not, and if you have an ADHD brain, that development of the prefrontal cortex is actually delayed by up to 3 years, okay? So you may have a 16-year-old who's operating with a 12 or 13-year-old brain, okay? And as far as this is concerned. So if you are already, a young one and your brain isn't fully developed, and then you add ADHD on top of that, it can get even more messy. So what this means is that the ADHD brain is not really unwilling, but really unable to conceptualize the abstract threat of losing a privilege. Okay, so like a video game or a favorite toy. If you don't finish your schoolwork, video games tonight. Okay, so therapists will encourage you to use rewards. And sometimes parents and caregivers can fight this because it feels like you're bribing your child to behave. But the way it works is the anticipation of a reward will create dopamine, right? And that's that neurotransmitter that's not really playing nice in our kid's brain. And so by coaxing the creation of dopamine, you're helping to gas up that prefrontal cortex so that it can go the distance, right? So you're giving the brain what it needs to function. You're putting gas in the car by promising a reward, right? That idea, I'm going to get something out of this, right? And then ultimately the delivery of that reward will also create dopamine as well, okay? So that is aiding the brain into that operational thinking that's required to remember that there is an enjoyable consequence to good behavior, okay? So instead of using punishment, we use rewards. So they don't have to be expensive, right? They can be just encouraging words, right? Maybe a ticket worth, a certain amount of time for screens, right? Whatever is valuable to your child, okay? As long as it's meaningful to them, it should be effective. Next, externalize the disorder or the behavior, right? One trick is giving it a name, right? So you can name your child's hyperactivity John, right? And whenever John shows up, you can just say like, oh, there he is, you know? And the reason why we do that is because we're just letting the child know that it isn't them, it's something that visits or happens to you, right? So it keeps them mindful of their actions in a way that's not shameful. And it doesn't mean that we don't have consequences for bad behavior or poor behavior, right? It just means that we have to really be mindful at how we communicate our displeasure to our children. Because again, the ADHD brain is prone to anxiety, prone to depression, prone to rumination. And so they will hear you say, why are you being so lazy? One time, and they will think that they're lazy the rest of their lives. Okay, so we have to be very careful. So when you externalize the disordered behavior, you're saying, well, John showed up and now this is what happened. And so next time John shows up, how can we approach this differently? Okay, something similar to that. Next, smother your kids with love. Okay, I know you're already doing that, but children with ADHD need that unconditional love bucket filled every day, even more than most, because they're constantly questioning their worth. So if you can imagine that your schoolwork, you struggle at school or you struggle at work, right? People are labeling you as lazy or sloppy or whatever. You're going to need something to counteract that, right? And that's where good caregiving come in. That's where good parenting comes in, that you're filling up that unconditional love bucket. So despite the things that they struggled with, they are still worthy and valuable of love, okay? So that's very important. Next, make your home a safe place to make mistakes, right? We all make mistakes. We're all learning, especially children. And so home should be a safe place to make those mistakes. And they need to know that all will be forgiven, right? Mistakes are how we learn. And if we yell at a child for a mistake that they can't control because of an impulsive brain, the child's takeaway is that they're going to be bad, right? Instead, say with like humor and love, like, it's okay to make mistakes, right? We're learning. It's not the end of the world, okay? Next, praise. So imagine that you're at work and all day long, your boss and your coworkers point out all the things that you're doing wrong. You go home and your family does the exact same thing, day after day. How would you feel about yourself? That's hard, right? To think about that. Because, in your parenting, you're just trying to keep your kid on the right track, right? And it's very difficult to stop and counteract that correction with positivity and praise. But we have to be very intentional for that, right? And when you praise your child, it actually creates dopamine, which is what they need, right? So the dopamine will help them to better control their behavior so they can do more wonderful things tomorrow, right? So praise is going to get you the result you're looking for greater than criticism ever will, okay? Focusing on your child's strengths, that is key to helping them cultivate a positive self-view. It's creating opportunities for them to help others by activating their strengths, right? So something really significant happens when parents and teachers start to focus on a child's strengths or their interests, or what we can call islands of competence.
Bring me your phone.
What was that? Oh, she's not talking to me. Okay. So instead of focusing on their challenges or their so-called deficits, your child can begin to see a future that they maybe didn't think they could have, right? Or that they couldn't even consider. So we need to be more focused on what the child can do and less on what they can't do. Okay, that's how we build resilience. That's how we build self-esteem. And then finally, participating in contributory or charitable activities is really good for your self-esteem. It boosts a sense of purpose, motivation, dignity, right? Making a positive difference in the lives of others can enrich your life and is a basic foundation for resilience. So these kind of activities can help children gain a sense of personal control, especially in tough times. So when children with ADHD do something they find meaningful and make a positive difference in the lives of others, it enhances their performance in school and their behavior and their overall well-being. So we're right at our 11 o'clock mark. Thank you. Here's my contact information if you need that. And then I also have my sources if you need those as well. So I'm going to stop the recording and I'm going to stop sharing. And this will be a good time.